sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Okay, so you want to get the down low on something big, right? Like really understand it without getting bogged down in, all the tiny little details.
Right.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Exactly.
We're taking a deep dive into the recent release of documents related to the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really unexpected twist to this story that I think you'll find super interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. I think folks have probably heard, in the news and such about these previously secret files being released.
Right.
So, what we want to do today is not only kind of dig into what these documents reveal, but also explore a surprising consequence that's come along with this release.
And so to really understand this, we're talking about the National Archives putting up online like roughly 2,200 files.
Wow.
That's over 63,000 pages of information that up until Tuesday evening had been kept completely secret.
And, to put that in perspective, this isn't just some, small isolated release. This is part of a much larger ongoing process.
Right.
Over 6 million pages of records related to the JFK assassination have been released over time. So this recent kind of drop is just another, piece of this very extensive historical record.
But here's where it takes a turn and becomes a little, eyebrow-raising, I guess you could say. This effort towards transparency has actually resulted in something that's pretty significant. The unintentional release of very sensitive personal details, including Social Security numbers.
Wow.
Of individuals who are named in these historical documents and who are very much still alive.
Yeah, that's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Kind of this move for greater transparency sort of inadvertently creates a new kind of vulnerability.
Exactly.
So maybe we should start with why these documents were released in the first place. What prompted this latest unveiling of this information?
Well, this actually came about from an order that was given by President Trump shortly after he took office back in January of this year, 2025.
Okay.
And the stated goal was to fulfill a commitment to maximum transparency regarding these very closely scrutinized historical records.
Maximum transparency, it's a principle that on the surface sounds pretty good.
Right.
But as you just pointed out, it's obviously been complicated by this disclosure of personal information.
Right.
So what's been the reaction to this? How has this been received?
Well, not everybody is thrilled.
Right.
Joseph DeGenova, who was a former campaign lawyer for President Trump, is one of the people whose information was exposed.
Okay.
And he is taking it very seriously.
Yeah, so I understand that DeGenova is actually planning on suing the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, right?
It is.
And his lawsuit really centers around these privacy law violations and this very real threat of identity theft that, this kind of exposure can create.
Right.
Which I think is really interesting. This legal challenge that he's bringing really highlights this kind of evolving tension between the public's right to know and then an individual's right to privacy.
In this digital age.
Yeah, in this digital age where we have, just such vast archives of information available.
So how did his information end up in these JFK files anyway? That seems like an odd connection.
Yeah, it is a bit odd. So it turns out that DeGenova's information was included in documents that were related to his work with a U.S. Senate Select Committee back in the 1970s.
Okay.
And that committee was investigating government abuses of power.
Okay.
Including the surveillance of American citizens.
So not about the Kennedy assassination itself, but about a subsequent investigation into, other government activities.
Exactly. Interesting. So his involvement wasn't directly tied to the assassination.
Okay, so his connection is indirect, and DeGenova has a theory about why this happened, right? He doesn't think it was some kind of intentional act.
He doesn't.
To put his information out there.
No, he doesn't. So DeGenova believes that the release of his Social Security number, and likely the Social Security numbers of other individuals, was the result of what he calls incompetent review of the documents.
Incompetent review, okay.
So his argument is that the people who were tasked with going through and redacting the sensitive information just didn't do their job effectively.
Right, so it was just a mistake. It wasn't a deliberate decision to release this information.
Right, exactly.
Which raises serious questions about the review process itself. So what has been the official response from the White House and the National Archives?
Sure. So both the White House and the National Archives have acknowledged this unintentional disclosure. So the White House released a statement. The National Archives also put out their own statement.
Okay.
And both of them basically expressed that they are aware of what happened and that they're committed to taking action to address the situation.
And what kind of action are they taking?
So according to their statements, the National Archives and the Social Security Administration are working together to develop a plan to help those individuals whose information has been compromised. One of the key things they've said is that they're going to offer credit monitoring provided by the National Archives to all of the affected individuals. And this credit monitoring will be available until new Social Security numbers can be issued to them.
But how can they know that they've identified every single person whose information was released?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And frankly, I'm not sure that they can know for sure.
Right.
The National Archives has said that they are still screening the thousands of released documents
Oh, wow.
to identify all of the Social Security numbers that were made public. So this suggests that the initial discovery of this exposed information may not have been exhaustive. You know, as somebody who has spent years going through historical documents myself, I can say that the idea of tackling a release of this magnitude without a proper index is just mind-boggling.
Right. It's a huge amount of information.
It's a huge amount of information, and it really underscores how important careful curation is when you're dealing with these kinds of sensitive records.
So they're still in the process of trying to find all the data that's been released. And what else have they said to reassure people?
Well, both the White House and the National Archives have emphasized their commitment to protecting those individuals whose personal information was revealed. The National Archives specifically mentioned that they will be reaching out to those who are affected.
Okay.
But they've also encouraged people who think that their information might be at risk to contact the archives directly.
It's interesting that they're asking individuals to take that initiative. Did either the White House or the National Archives explain why this personal information was released in the first place?
You know, that's a really important question. And so far, it seems like neither the White House nor the National Archives has provided a clear explanation about the decision-making process that led to this era.
Okay, so we don't really know how it happened, but we know it was a mistake. Okay, so that's the personal information side of it. But let's talk about the content of the documents themselves. Were there any big surprises in there? Did we learn anything new about the Kennedy assassination?
Well, early assessments suggest that the newly unredacted documents mainly provide more detail about covert U.S. operations during the Cold War, you know, things like espionage activities in other countries.
Okay.
So while these details are certainly historically significant, it doesn't look like they really change our understanding of who killed Kennedy.
Okay, so a lot of anticipation for these documents, and it sounds like we're learning more about the broader context of the time period rather than the specifics of the assassination.
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
You mentioned an example earlier of a document that included Social Security numbers. Could you remind me about that?
Yeah, so one example that stood out is the release of Social Security numbers that belonged to more than 24 people who were seeking security clearances in the 1990s.
Okay.
Their purpose was to review JFK-related documents for the Assassination Records Review Board.
Right, so again, not connected to the events of 1963.
Exactly.
But involved in the study of the assassination later on.
Right.
It's just amazing to me how much sensitive information can be tangled up in these historical events. It's not just about the main event itself. All these other details can get caught in the crossfire. And with a release like this, it's hard not to wonder if the review process was really thorough enough.
Yeah, and a lot of people share that concern, including Daryl Posner.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you know, he's the author of Case Closed, that really well-known book that supports the lone gunman theory.
Right.
And he's one of several researchers who believe that this document release was rushed.
Rushed even after all this time. Why do they think that?
Well, Posner has pointed to the sheer volume of documents that were released. You know, we're talking over 63,000 pages just in this latest batch.
Right. That's a lot.
Yeah, and he's also highlighted the fact that this time, unlike previous releases, there was no detailed search guide provided.
Right.
So this makes targeted research a lot more challenging. It's like, you know, imagine being given this enormous library with no card catalog.
Right. You'd have no idea where to find anything.
Exactly. And Posner gave a really specific example of this. He talked about trying to locate documents related to James Jesus Angleton, who was the CIA's counterintelligence chief during the Cold War.
Oh, right.
And he said, you know, without a proper search guide, trying to track down specific files related to Angleton becomes this incredibly time-consuming and frustrating task.
So it's not just about potential privacy issues. It's also about how difficult it is to actually access and use this historical information.
Right. It raises questions about the way this release was handled.
So to go back to the privacy issue, what are the next steps that are being taken to address that?
Well, as we discussed earlier, the National Archives has started a screening process specifically to identify all the released Social Security numbers.
Okay.
And once they've compiled a complete list, they're going to share it with the Social Security Administration.
Right.
And then the Social Security Administration will be responsible for issuing new Social Security numbers to the living individuals whose numbers were exposed.
Just as a quick reminder for everybody, can we just recap the basic facts of the Kennedy assassination?
Sure. So President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November 1963.
Right.
Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested shortly afterwards and was identified as the shooter who fired from the Texas School Book Depository.
Right.
But before he could stand trial, Oswald was fatally shot by Jack Ruby
Wow.
during a live television broadcast of his transfer from one jail to another.
An absolutely pivotal moment in American history, and one that continues to spark conversation and debate.
Absolutely.
And, as we've seen today, sometimes unexpected consequences decades later.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the release of these JFK assassination documents, although intended to increase transparency, has unfortunately resulted in the exposure of personal information belonging to living individuals.
Right.
Which is a big deal.
Yeah.
This has, understandably caused a lot of concern, and it's also led to legal action and a response from the government trying to address the situation.
Right. It really highlights the challenges of trying to balance the public's right to know with the need to protect individual privacy.
Especially in the digital age where information spreads so quickly and easily.
Exactly. And the second big takeaway is that while these newly released documents do provide more detailed information about Cold War operations, they don't seem to fundamentally change our understanding of the Kennedy assassination itself, right? At least not in terms of who was responsible.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So a lot of work and anticipation went into releasing these documents, but maybe not the huge revelation that some people were expecting.
Right.
Well, this whole situation has really got me thinking about the implications of declassifying sensitive information. This tension between historical transparency and individual privacy is so relevant today, especially in our digital world.
Absolutely.
So how should governments balance these competing interests in the future?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
It's a tough one, and it also makes you think about the challenges of managing and reviewing these massive amounts of historical data. Even with the best intentions, there's always the potential for something to go wrong.
It's a sobering thought.
It is, and it's something that we all need to be aware of as we navigate this increasingly complex information landscape.
I agree.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been fascinating.
Yeah, it has.
And until next time, stay curious.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.